She was a war hero, blinded and abandoned, until a broken soldier in Ohio's quiet suburbs hears her cry, changing his life forever. This is a story of loyalty, redemption, and love beyond sight. Mathieu Durand, 47, lived alone on Willow Bend Lane in Riverside Grove near Columbus. His faded home stood empty since his wife Claire's death, until that fateful night. Welcome to Frenchy Tales. Here we post heartwarming stories of French Bulldog every day. If you like our stories, press subscribe. Also like and share video. In the quiet suburb of Riverside Grove, just beyond the hum of Columbus, Ohio, Mathieu Durand lived at the end of Willow Bend Lane. His home was a modest single-story ranch, its beige siding chipped like old memories, its shutters peeling in, the wind as if whispering secrets they could no longer hold. The backyard stretched wild and untamed, a tangle of overgrown grass and skeletal shrubs where no flowers had bloomed since Claire, his wife, slipped away 3 winters ago. The wooden fence leaned in places, stubborn in others, a silent sentinel around a house that wasn't dead, just waiting. Mathieu, at 47, carried the weight of those years in the slope of his shoulders, once broad with a soldier's pride, now softened by silence. His ash-grey eyes, dulled by time and grief, peered out from a face framed by thinning hair that revealed the shape of his thoughts. Quiet, precise, a rhythm left over from years of following orders. Most days, Mathieu wore the same faded uniform, dark jeans streaked with old oil, a grey sweater with a frayed cuff and combat boots that had once marched through desert sand. He mowed the lawn, trimmed the hedge, fixed what broke, but he didn't speak much, not to neighbors, not to the wind, and rarely even to himself. Claire had been his voice, tall and gentle, a woman who wore kindness like a soft shawl and loved her garden more than the sun itself. When ovarian cancer took her, it hollowed Mathieu out, leaving him scraped clean of joy. He'd closed the shutters, silenced the radio, and turned the garage into a refuge of rusted tools and old engines, things that didn't ask for his heart. He didn't hate the world, he just didn't believe it had anything left to offer him. That belief shattered on a frigid April night in 2025. It was nearly midnight, and Mathieu stood in his kitchen, cradling a mug of black coffee that had long gone cold. The house was still, the only sound the faint creak of the floorboards settling under the weight of another lonely day. Then it came, a low, cracked whimper, half sob, half surrender, rising from the backyard like a ghost from a war dream. Mathieu froze, the mug trembling in his hand, his chest tightening as the sound clawed at something deep inside him. He waited, breath held, thinking it might be a fox or a raccoon tangled in the brush. But it came again, longer this time, rawer, a plea that wouldn't let him turn away. He set the mug down, the clink against the counter sharp in the silence, and reached for his coat, a thick, military-issue jacket patched at the elbow, the E. Last thing Claire had ever sewn for him. The fabric still held the faint scent of her lavender soap, a whisper of her that he carried into the night. Stepping outside, the backyard glittered under a thin crust of snow, the moonlight painting it silver. The air was sharp, biting at his lungs, and the bare trees swayed gently, their branches clawing at the sky. The whimper came again, softer now, like something giving up, pulling him past the barren garden bed, through the open gate and toward the cluster of overgrown shrubs near the fence. Mathieu didn't bring a flashlight. He didn't need one. His eyes, trained by years of night patrols, found her in the shadows, a small trembling shape curled into the hollowed earth. It was a French Bulldog, her brindle coat matted with mud and frost, her body frail but unmistakably alive. She was larger than he'd expected for the breed, her compact frame stretched thin by hardship, her ribs pressing out like fragile promises beneath her skin. Her ears, short and ragged, twitched faintly, one torn at the tip, and her legs quivered as she tried to shield something behind her. Mathieu crouched low, his breath fogging in the cold. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. "I'm not here to hurt you." She didn't snarl, didn't flinch, but her head turned blindly, nose twitching as she tried to place him in the dark. That's when he saw her eyes, clouded white, empty of light, staring into nothing. She was blind. And then, behind her, a flicker of movement, a tiny whimper. Puppies, 5 of them, so small they looked like crumpled leaves pressed against her belly. One lifted its head, a weak tremble before collapsing back into its siblings. Mathieu's heart stuttered. "Jesus," he whispered, blinking hard against the sting in his eyes. "How the hell did you get here?" The night offered no answers, but the urgency did. The cold was a killer, creeping into anything too small, too starved. She wouldn't last much longer. Neither would they. Mathieu shrugged off his coat, laying it gently on the snow. And one by one, he slid the puppies into its warmth, their soft squeaks tugging at him like threads of a forgotten song. Then, with a tenderness he hadn't known he still had, he slipped an arm under her. She was lighter than she should have been, all bone and breath, and as he lifted her, she let out a sound so faint it felt like an apology. She didn't fight him. She just trembled, trusting him with what little she had left. Back inside, Mathieu spread a blanket by the heater and settled her there, arranging the pups at her side. The house, so long a tomb, hummed with fragile life. He brought a bowl of warm water and a scrap of chicken from the fridge, simple offerings for a soldier who'd marched too far. She drank, slow and deliberate, her tongue lapping with a quiet dignity that broke something open in him. For the first time in years, Mathieu didn't retreat to the garage. He sat on the kitchen floor, watching her breathe, the pups wriggling against her, and felt the stirrings of a warmth he thought he'd buried with Claire. This wasn't just a rescue, it was a beginning. Mathieu Durand didn't sleep that night. The kitchen floor was cold beneath him, the linoleum pressing into his knees, but he stayed there, cross-legged and still, watching the small family he'd brought in from the snow. The French Bulldog lay on the blanket by the heater, her brindle, coat dulled by mud and frost, her ribs a stark outline beneath her skin. Her breath was shallow but steady, a rhythm that seemed to sync with the soft hum of the house waking up around her. The puppies, 5 tiny, shivering bundles, nuzzled against her belly, their squeaks and wriggles filling the silence that had ruled Mathieu's world for too long. He didn't know how they'd survived the cold, how she'd kept them alive with her frail body, but he knew one thing: they were here now and he couldn't look away. The heater clicked, casting a warm glow across her face, and Mathieu studied her. She was smaller than he'd first thought, her French Bulldog frame compact yet worn, her short snout glistening as she licked the last of the chicken he'd offered. Her ears, ragged and torn, twitched faintly at every sound, the pup's whimpers, the wind brushing the windows, the creak of his own shifting weight. But her eyes, those milky, clouded eyes, stared into nothing, unseeing yet somehow piercing. She was blind, that much was clear, and the weight of that truth settled into Mathieu like a stone. What had she been through to end up here, alone, hand broken in his backyard? He reached for the bowl of water he'd set beside her, nudging it closer. She lifted her head, nose twitching, and drank again, not greedily, but with a soldier's measured desperation, as if she'd learned to savor every drop. The pup stirred, one rolling onto its back with a silent yawn, its tiny paws flailing in the air. Mathieu's lips twitched, the ghost of a smile he hadn't felt in years. He didn't return to the garage that night, didn't tinker with the engines that had been his shield against feeling. Instead, he stayed, the mug of cold coffee forgotten on the counter, and let the house breathe with new life. Morning came slow and grey, the April light filtering through the blinds in soft streaks. Mathieu hadn't moved much, his back stiff, from the floor, but he didn't mind. The pups were stronger now, their squeaks louder as they jostled for space against their mother. She shifted, nudging them closer with her snout, her movements careful and deliberate despite her weakness. Mathieu stood, joints creaking, and grabbed his phone. He didn't know much about dogs, less about puppies, but he knew they needed more than water and scraps. He dialed the local vet, a woman named Dr. Lena Moreau, whose number Claire had once scribbled on a napkin after a neighbor's cat got sick. "She's good," Claire had said, her voice soft with trust. Mathieu hoped. She was right. Lena arrived by noon, her pickup crunching gravel in the driveway. She was tall and lean, in her early 50s, with grey-streaked hair pulled into a loose ponytail and hands that moved with a quiet confidence. She wore jeans tucked into brown boots and a long canvas coat, pockets bulging with pens and tools. Her face was kind but guarded, carved by years of loss, 2 divorces and a dog of her own taken by a car 5 years back. She didn't smile as she stepped inside, but her eyes softened when they landed on the blanket by the heater. "Heard you." "Found something," she said, her voice low and steady like she'd seen too much to waste words. Mathieu nodded, stepping aside. "Last night, in the backyard, she's blind and there's 5 of them." Lena knelt beside the dog, her movements slow and deliberate, giving the mother time to sense her. The French Bulldog tensed, her breath catching, but she didn't growl. Lena ran a hand along her side, fingers tracing the jutting ribs, the matted fur. "She's underweight," she said, her tone matter of fact. "Barely survived the birth. Blindness looks old. Scarring, maybe. Chemical exposure." She lifted the dog's lip, checked her gums, then glanced at the pups. "They're fighters, though, might just make it." Mathieu folded his arms, watching her work. "She didn't growl, not once, even when I picked her up." Lena paused, her hand still on the dog's flank, and looked up at him. "That's not fear. That's trust." The words hung there, simple but heavy, and Mathieu felt them settle into him. Trust. He hadn't thought about it like that. Hadn't thought anyone, man or beast, could trust him after he'd shut the world out. Lena stood, brushing her hands on her coat. "You'll need puppy milk formula, blankets, syringes, patience too. I'll write it down." She pulled a notepad from her pocket, scribbling as she spoke, then tore off the page and handed it to him. "Call me if she stops eating. When..." Lena left. Mathieu drove to the pet store, the list crumpled in his fist. He came back with everything she'd written and more: a soft fleece blanket, a heating pad, a can of formula that smelled faintly sweet. He mixed it carefully, following the instructions like they were orders from a commanding officer, and sat beside the dog again. She sniffed the syringe, then lapped at it, her tongue clumsy but determined. The pups squirmed, and Mathieu fed. Them too, one by one, their tiny mouths tugging at the rubber tip. It was messy, slow, but it felt right, like mending something he hadn't known was broken. That night, the house was different. The pups stirred in their sleep. The mother dozed, in warm silence, and Mathieu sat in Claire's old armchair, the one she'd read in by the window. Shadows danced across the floor, cast by the streetlight outside, and he watched them, his hands still smelling of formula. He didn't know where she'd come from, didn't know her name, but something in her silence spoke to his own. A shared language of survival. As he watched her ears twitch in sleep, her body curled protectively around the pups, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't in years. Purpose. Maybe he hadn't rescued her. Maybe she'd come to rescue him. The days blurred into a gentle rhythm at the end of Willow Bend Lane, each one marked by the soft sounds of life Mathieu Durand had almost forgotten could exist. The kitchen, once a sterile echo of his solitude, now hummed with the squeaks and rustles of Colette and her 5 puppies. The French Bulldog, still unnamed in those first few days, lay on her fleece blanket by the heater, her brindle coat slowly regaining a faint sheen as she ate the soft food Mathieu offered: canned chicken, warm water, bits of formula-soaked kibble. Her movements were cautious, her blindness forcing her to map the space with her nose and ears, but there was a quiet strength to her, a dignity that refused to bend despite the scars etched into her small frame. Mathieu watched her closely, his ash-gray eyes tracing the way she nudged her pups back to her side when they strayed too far. They were growing now, their tiny bodies filling out, their fur fluffing into patches of gold, cream, and soft brown. The smallest one, a runt with oversized ears, would stumble over his siblings, only to scramble back with a sharp little bark. That made Mathieu's chest ache with something like laughter. He'd taken to sitting on the floor with them each night, the old armchair abandoned, his hands steady as he fed the pups from syringes or wiped their faces with a damp cloth. Colette never flinched at his touch, her head tilting toward him, as if she could sense the warmth in his calloused fingers, a trust that left him both humbled and unsteady. It was the 3rd day when the name came to him. He'd been watching her after the pups had fallen asleep, their soft snores a chorus against the crackle of the heater. She sat up briefly, her strong jawline catching the light, her shoulders stiff from old injuries yet unyielding. She didn't whimper, didn't beg, just endured. A survivor who'd carried her babies through God knows what to end up in his backyard. Mathieu leaned forward, a mug of coffee cooling in his hands, and murmured, "You're not just any stray, are you?" Her ears flicked toward him, alert but calm. "You're a fighter, a protector." He paused, the name rising unbidden from a memory of Claire reading aloud one winter night, her voice weaving tales of French heroines. "You're Colette." He said it again, softer this time. "Colette." And her head turned fully toward him, nose twitching, and he could have sworn her stubby tail gave the faintest wag. The name fit like a key in a lock. Colette, a name from stories of war and love, of mothers who guarded what mattered most. It stuck, and from that moment she wasn't just the blind dog he'd found. She was Colette, his Colette, and the house felt less like a shell with her name echoing in its corners. The pups needed names too, he decided, as they began to show their personalities. He scribbled them in a notebook he'd dug out from a drawer, a new habit forming. The boldest, a female with a shimmering coat, became Étoile, star, for the way she seemed to shine, always climbing over the others. The thoughtful male with wide, searching eyes was Remy, quiet and observant. Lune, a curious female, wandered off to sniff corners, her pale fur glowing like moonlight. Sol, the darkest coated, was calm and content to sleep long hours by Colette's side. And the runt, feisty despite his stumbles, was Cendre, Ash, for the greyish tint in his fur and the fire in his tiny barks. Naming them felt like claiming them, like promising they'd never be lost again. As Colette grew stronger, Mathieu felt an itch of curiosity, or maybe it was memory, gnawing at him. Something in the way she held herself, the discipline in her steps despite her blindness, reminded him of the K9 units he'd served with. He pulled out his old laptop, blew off the dust, and started searching. French Bulldog, female, retired. Military blind brought up a flood of results, most useless, but then, buried in a grainy military blog from 4 years back, he found her. The photo was blurry, taken in a sandstorm, but the outline was unmistakable. Unit K9147, Colette, a French Bulldog in Afghanistan. She'd saved 5 soldiers by detecting an IED early, her handler a young corporal named Pierre Leclerc. But, in the chaos of evacuation, white phosphorus had burned her eyes, leaving her blind. Declared unfit, she'd been discharged to a civilian shelter. Then nothing. No adoption, no record, just gone. Mathieu stared at the screen. The room suddenly, colder despite the heater's glow. "They left you behind," he whispered, his voice cracking. He looked at Colette, now curled around her pups, her breathing even and slow. She'd been a hero, trained to protect men like him, and they'd discarded her when she couldn't. See? Anger flared in him, then softened into something else. Gratitude that she'd found him, that she'd trusted him with her life and her babies. That night, he began small routines. He fed her at regular intervals, speaking her name in a calm, steady tone. "Colette, here," he'd say, tapping the floor, and she'd shuffle toward him, her steps tentative but sure. He didn't push her, didn't retrain her, just restored what he could of her dignity. She responded, her ears perking at his voice, her body relaxing in his presence. The pups tumbled around her, and Mathieu found himself smiling, really smiling, as Cendre barked at a shadow, only to trip into Saul. Sitting in Claire's armchair later, the notebook open on his lap, he wrote, Day 5. Colette stood today, sniffed, her way to the water without help. Cendre's feisty, reminds me of Leclerc, always charging ahead. He paused, glancing at her. She's not broken. She's a survivor. Like me, maybe. The house was alive now, the stillness replaced by the patter of tiny paws and Colette's quiet presence. Mathieu didn't know why she'd come to him, but as he watched her guard her pups with blind, unwavering love, he felt the first stirrings of a truth. She wasn't just here to be saved. She was here to save him, too. The days grew warmer in Riverside Grove, the snow melting into patches of damp earth. But a chill lingered in Mathieu Durand's bones, one that had nothing to do with the weather. Colette and her pups had settled into his home, their presence a steady heartbeat against the silence that once ruled Willow Bend Lane. The French Bulldog, now stronger, moved with a cautious grace, her blind eyes no barrier to the way she guarded her 5 little ones. Etoile bounded ahead. Remy watched with quiet eyes. Lune explored every corner. Soul dozed in sunny spots, and Cendre, the feisty runt, barked at shadows with a fire that made Mathieu chuckle. The house was alive, messy, with chewed socks and spilled water, but alive, and Mathieu felt its pulse in his own chest. He'd started training Colette gently, not to command but to connect. A soft whistle meant food, a tap on the floor meant come, and she responded, her ears swiveling toward him, her stubby tail giving a faint wag. The pups watched too, especially Etoile, who mimicked her mother's alertness. Mathieu wrote in his notebook each night, a habit now, day 12. Colette knows the room by heart. Cendre tripped over my boot, still got up barking. The words were simple, but they anchored him, tethering him to this new life. He didn't notice the first mark until a crisp morning when he stepped outside to fix the garage light. There, carved into the wooden siding beneath the gutter, was a symbol. 3 diagonal slashes through a circle, precise and fresh. He brushed his fingers over it, his jaw tightening. He'd seen it before, years ago in a war zone, a tag from a radical. Cell tied to a mission gone wrong. It wasn't random. That night, Colette grew restless. She paced the kitchen, her nails clicking on the linoleum, her head tilting at sounds Mathieu couldn't hear. He set up a trail cam by the back fence, its lens trained on the yard. The next morning, the footage showed a man, tall, slim, face obscured, standing just beyond the trees at 3:14 a.m., hands in his pockets, watching the house. Colette had growled that night, a low rumble Mathieu had dismissed as a dream. Now, he knew better. He called Luc Renault, an old army buddy in private security, his voice gruff over the phone. That symbol, it's from the Hellman cell, and RGLA from her harness. It's an outpost near Kandahar, off-record K9 training. If she's from there, someone wants her gone. Mathieu's grip tightened. Why here? Why now? Luc's pause was heavy. If they're tagging your house, they're not lost. The marks multiplied, another on the fence deeper with a scrap of camouflage fabric in the dirt. Colette's alertness sharpened, her body tensing at every creak. Mathieu reinforced the locks, his soldier's instincts waking from their long sleep. Then, one evening, Cendre went missing. Mathieu had let the pups play in the yard, supervised as always, but Cendre's stubborn streak kept him out longer. When Mathieu called, no bark answered. He found a half-eaten biscuit near the fence, dusted with a bitter powder, and boot prints leading into the woods. Colette was already at the gate, pacing, a growl vibrating in her throat. She knew before he did. Mathieu grabbed his gear, flashlight, knife sidearm, and pulled a tactical vest from the cabinet, its weight familiar. Colette stayed at his side as they entered the woods behind Riverside Grove, the trail clear. Broken branches, crumbs, paw prints. The air grew thick with fog, old oaks twisting overhead, but Colette moved with purpose, her blindness no match for her instincts. After 20 minutes, they reached a rotted cabin, footprints circling it, smoke stains fresh on the chimney. Mathieu pushed the door open with his boot, the smell of damp wood and dog hitting him. In a metal cage in the corner, Cendre whimpered, shivering but alive. Mathieu knelt, working the padlock with his knife. "Easy, buddy, I've got you." The door slammed shut behind him, boots thudding on the floor, 3 sets. He stood slowly, turning to face them. 3 men, armed. The tallest, with a serpent tattoo on his neck, held a knife loosely. The second, broad with a scarred cheek, limped slightly. The third stepped from the shadows, his voice a cold echo from the past. "Been a long time, Durand." Mathieu exhaled. "Karim Voss." The man smiled, his scar, temple to jaw, faint but unmistakable. He'd been a liaison in Afghanistan, a traitor who'd vanished after a botched extraction, leaving bodies and secrets behind. "I didn't expect you to find me," Mathieu said, steadying his breath. Voss chuckled. "I didn't expect your dog to still be breathing." He nodded to the others. "I want her." She saw what happened at the outpost. Civilians, fire, orders disobeyed. She's evidence. Mathieu drew his sidearm fast and fluid. "Try me." Voss raised a hand, stopping the knife man. "I need her alive. Memory's power, Durand." Mathieu's eyes flicked to the room. One exit, no windows. "Where was Colette?" a growl answered, low and deadly. She burst through the half-rotted wall, splinters flying, her small body a missile of fury. She hit the knife man first, knocking him down with a scream. Mathieu struck the second with his pistol's butt as he turned. Voss stumbled back, reaching for his coat. Mathieu fired, a shoulder shot, enough to drop him. Voss crumpled, gasping. The room stilled. Mathieu broke the cage lock, pulling Sandra into his arms, the pup trembling but safe. Colette stood over the fallen attacker, solid as stone, her breath heaving. Back home, Luc was waiting, alerted by the empty yard. Mathieu emerged from the trees, blood on his sleeve, Sandra in his coat, Colette limping behind. "Trouble?" Luc asked. "The worst kind," Mathieu said, handing him the pup. They patched. Colette's leg, bruised, not broken, and Sandra slept between a towel and Mathieu's chest. That night, Mathieu stood at the window, the woods swaying in the wind. He opened his notebook. Day 21. Sandra's home. Colette saved us again. Voss is here, after her memory. Why Columbus? It's not random. He looked at Colette, lying between the pups, listening. The past had followed them and the fight wasn't over. The storm came fast that night, not with rain or thunder, but with a heavy stillness that pressed against the windows of Mathieu Durand's home on Willow Bend Lane. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the pups restless in their blanket nest, their tiny yips cutting through the quiet. Colette paced near the back door, her blind eyes wide, her ears twitching at every shift in the wind. Mathieu stood by the window, a mug of coffee cooling in his hand, his sidearm within reach. 4 nights had passed since the cabin confrontation, 4 nights of watching the trail cam, double-checking locks and feeling the past creep closer. Karim Voss was still out there, wounded but alive, and Mathieu knew he wouldn't stop, not until he silenced Colette and the memories she carried. It started with a crack, sharp, close, a boot on the porch steps. Colette surged up, teeth bared, her growl vibrating the floorboards. Mathieu dropped the mug, glass shattering, and grabbed the flashlight and crowbar. He stepped outside, the night swallowing him. But Colette was already gone, a blur of brindle fur darting toward the yard's edge. Then came the scream, short, guttural, more shock than pain. Mathieu sprinted after her, snow crunching under. His boots, breath fogging the air. He reached the fence in time to see Voss stumbling back, clutching a bleeding arm, Colette standing before him, lips curled in fury. Voss turned and ran, crimson dripping across the snow, but Mathieu's eyes were on Colette, trembling, not from fear but from restraint. She could have torn him apart. She chose not to. "Good girl," he whispered, kneeling beside her, his hand warm on her back. Back inside, the trail cam footage revealed more. Voss slipping through the fence, pistol glinting in his hand, his scarred face caught in the porch light. Mathieu recognized him fully now. Rashid Dazi, as Luc had called him, the traitor from their last mission, a ghost who'd orchestrated a massacre and vanished. He'd come for Colette, for what she'd seen at the outpost. Mathieu called Luc, his voice steady. "It's Dazi, he's here." Luc arrived the next day, a wiry ex-Delta operator with Riverstone eyes and a battered Chevy. They reviewed the footage in silence, Luc's jaw tight. "He's not here for you," he said finally. "He's here for her or what she knows." Colette stood suddenly facing the window, her body stiff. A soft knock came, not on the door, but the window. Mathieu froze. Luc drew his Glock. They found only a new mark carved into the siding, a circle, slashes, an arrow pointing east. The next morning, Sandra was gone. Mathieu had let the pups play in the yard, their joyful chaos a balm, but Sandra's absence hit like a punch. Near the fence, a powdery biscuit and boot prints led into the woods. Colette paced, growling, and Mathieu geared up, Vest, knife, gun. They followed the trail, Colette unwavering beside him, until they reached the cabin again. Inside, Sandra whimpered in his cage. As Mathieu worked the lock, the door slammed shut. 3 men, Darcy and 2 others, emerged, guns drawn. "I want the dog," Darcy said, his voice cold. She saw too much. Mathieu drew his sidearm. "She's not yours," Colette answered before he could act. She launched from the shadows a missile of love and fury, knocking Darcy down as he fired. The bullet tore through her chest and she tumbled, but her jaws clamped onto his arm, pinning him. Mathieu fired twice, stomach, chest, and Darcy fell still. Silence roared. Mathieu crawled to Colette, cradling her, blood mixing with his. Her breath hitched, her blind eyes searching, and then the pups arrived. Étoile leading, Remy, Lune, Sol, and Sandra stumbling last. They nuzzled her, whining, and her ears lifted faintly. She'd waited for them. "You saved us," Mathieu whispered, tears breaking free. She sighed, her head warm in his lap, and then she was gone. They buried her that night under the sugar maple Claire had planted, snowflakes melting into the soil. Mathieu carved a river rock, guardian, mother, soul. Luc knelt beside her, silent, while Dr. Lena Moreau arrived, her hands trembling, as she stroked Colette's fur. "She fought to the end?" she asked. Mathieu nodded. "She never stopped." Lena's voice softened. "Dogs know who we are, even when we don't." Later, Mathieu wrote, "Day 27. Colette's gone, but she's in them, in Étoile's courage, Sandra's fire. She saw me when I couldn't see myself. Spring came softly to Columbus, the maple budding above Colette's grave. The pups grew, Étoile. Sleek and alert, Remy thoughtful, Lune curious, Sol calm, Sandra stubborn. Mathieu trained them daily, Étoile excelling at commands, her focus uncanny. Lena suggested a guide dog program. "She's halfway there," she said, sipping tea on the porch, her guard easing since Colette's death. Mathieu unrolled Étoile, and weeks later she paired with Edith Maynard, a sharp-tongued 79-year-old blind woman who adored her. "She listens better than my kids," Edith laughed when Mathieu visited. Étoile leapt into his arms, then returned. To Edith's side, steady and proud. Mathieu renovated the garage into a writing room, a space Claire had once dreamed of for him. He wrote Eyes of the Heart, Colette's story, a tribute to her, a small book of prose about war, grief, and love. It ended. She never saw my face, but she knew me. Past the scars, past the dark. I was blind, and she guided me home. Printed. Locally, it spread quietly, touching those who'd known dogs like her. One night, driving past a railroad sign, RGLA, he stopped. It clicked. A K9 transfer depot near Columbus. She'd been sent here, forgotten, until she found him. Beneath the maple, Mathieu sat with his journal, day 78. She's everywhere, in the pups, in the wind. Why Columbus? Maybe it's where the lost come to be seen. The pups sprawled around him, fireflies flickering. He whispered, "Colette didn't see, but she saw me, clearer than anyone." Her love had lifted him, a miracle of fur and heart. He closed his eyes, the stars above whispering back, "Some heroes don't need wings, they come with paws and they stay forever."